Come join me on my second channel, Jaguar Gator 8, where we'll talk all things college football. New video drops every Monday at 6 p.m. Eastern. Click the card in the upper right corner to watch the latest video. And now, on with our feature presentation. I want you to imagine this scenario. The Jacksonville Jaguars play one game a year in London. Now imagine if owner Shad Khan announces that the London series is going to be discontinued, and they're going to play all of their home games in Jacksonville from this point on. Imagine if Trevor Lawrence came out and not only objected to this decision, but said that if it was up to him, the Jaguars wouldn't be in Jacksonville anymore. He loves playing in London more than he loves playing in Jacksonville, and he wishes that every game could be held there, and that Jacksonville wouldn't have a team anymore. Obviously, saying something like that would be ridiculously stupid. Way to alienate your home fan base. Saying that your team should move to a different city while you're still a member of that team doesn't seem like the smartest move in the book for a variety of reasons. However, this is Hall of Famer James Lofton. He's not just one of the greatest wide receivers in the history of the Green Bay Packers, heck, he might be number 2 behind Don Hudson, but he's one of the greatest wide receivers in the history of the NFL. He had a lot of great moments with the Packers, making it to 7 Pro Bowls, leading the league in yards per reception twice, being named a first-team All-Pro in 1981 and a second-team All-Pro an additional 3 times, and being named to the All-1980 second team. But in 1983, he said something really stupid that left a lot of Packers fans turning their heads and wondering why the heck their best player would even say such a thing. Because in 1983, James Lofton said that if it was up to him, the Green Bay Packers would not be playing in Green Bay anymore. And this is the story behind the rather bizarre moment. Before I talk about the actual comment in question and what led up to it, we need some context to understand the rather unique situation that the Green Bay Packers were in compared to other teams in the National Football League. In 1983, there were 28 teams in the NFL. Of those 28 teams, 27 of them played every single home game in one stadium. The Cowboys played every game at Texas Stadium, the Bears played every game at Soldier Field, the Vikings played every game at the Metrodome. You get the idea. You had one home facility, and that was it. However, there was one exception to the rule, and that came with the Green Bay Packers. Because in 1983, the Packers were splitting their season across 2 cities, playing the majority of their games in Green Bay, but then playing some games over 100 miles away in Milwaukee. The reason for this can be traced all the way back to 1933, half a century ago, when the Packers used Milwaukee games as a way to attract more revenue and grow their fan base. The agreement was also used as a way to get Green Bay to make necessary upgrades to their stadium, as at one point in the 50s, Green Bay Stadium was in such dire need of repair that they were going to move to Milwaukee if they didn't do something about it, which is how Lambeau Field got built in the first place. While the Packers played most of their games in Green Bay, they typically played at least 3 games in Milwaukee. In 1978 and 1980, they even played 4 home games in Milwaukee, splitting the season evenly between the 2 cities. And this is not the first time I've done a video on the relationship between the Packers and Milwaukee, as I spoke about an incident that took place later in the 1980s. You can learn more about that by clicking the card in the upper right corner. And for the most part at this point in the 1980s, when our story was taking place, Milwaukee and the Packers had a great relationship. Bud Selig was the owner of the Brewers and would eventually become a member of the Packers board of directors. And when I got the chance to speak to Selig, he said that the 2 teams had a great relationship. However, by 1983, the Packers were ready to, at the very least, cut back on the number of games that they were playing in Milwaukee. There were a few reasons for this. Number 1, playing in Milwaukee increased travel costs. Instead of having to figure out travel for 8 games a year, you had to figure out travel for 11 or 12 games. And that money adds up, even if it might not seem like a lot since the 2 cities are only separated by 100 or so miles. It also didn't help that the whole point of the Milwaukee series was to increase revenue, because it was impractical based on the size of Green Bay and the stadium conditions to play an entire season there. However, by this point, Green Bay was more than capable of sustaining itself over the course of an entire season, and the stadium in Milwaukee was making improvements that benefited the Brewers and did not help the Packers, since the sightlines were catered for baseball and were somewhat messed up for football. Remember that when the Packers first started playing games at Milwaukee County Stadium, the Brewers were not a thing. But by 1983, especially after an American League pennant, they were a staple of the city. But perhaps the biggest turning point came during the 1982 season, when a bizarre scheduling quirk happened. In every season, the Packers played a minimum of 50% of their games in Green Bay. In 1982, however, for the first time ever, Milwaukee wound up hosting more games than Green Bay. For all intents and purposes, they were the Milwaukee Packers. Even the New York Times put out an article saying that they were the Milwaukee Packers. In 1982, there was a strike that eliminated 9 games from the season. You can learn more about the strike and a bizarre incident involving the late great broadcaster John Madden that happened during the strike by clicking the card in the upper right corner. And it just so happened that for the Packers, most of the home games that the strike eliminated were games scheduled for Lambeau Field. At the end of the day, the Packers played 4 games in their 9-game season at home. 3 of them were in Milwaukee, and only 1 regular season game, a 30-10 loss to the Detroit Lions, took place at Lambeau Field. Imagine if there was a year where the Jacksonville Jaguars played 6 games in London and only 2 in Jacksonville. Seems bizarre and ridiculous, right? Well, that's kind of what happened in 1982 with the Packers. And with all of these factors taken into account, Packer officials wanted to reduce the number of games played in Milwaukee. They weren't looking to get rid of the Milwaukee agreement by any means, but they wanted to reduce it from 3 to 4 games a year to just 2 games a year, beginning in 1984. Robert McCullough, the president of Milwaukee County Stadium at the time, said, "We wanted as much as we could get, and that's all we could get. We would have loved to have had the same number of games as in the past, but we're just happy to have the Packers here for another 2 years." Understandably, the Milwaukee fans weren't too thrilled about this, with Penny Podol, a Milwaukee County board member, saying bluntly on the situation, "Someone has to stick up for the fans. Milwaukee area fans have been loyal to the Packers. This is unfair to Milwaukee fans." The fans have strong opinions on this, but what do the players think about the proposal? After all, they're the ones having to play on both fields. They're the ones having to travel, and they're the ones involved in the games. Well, wide receiver James Lofton had a, shall we say, interesting take on the matter. Because instead of saying what probably would have been the smartest thing and saying, "I don't know how this situation is going to play out, because I don't know what's going on behind closed doors, but we love our fans in Green Bay and Milwaukee, and no matter how many games we play in Milwaukee, I know that we're going to get great fan support there," he decided to take a completely different approach. If it was up to him, let's get the hell out of Green Bay and move to Milwaukee. Yeah, seems kind of weird that a player, especially one of Lofton's caliber who is, at this point in time, arguably the best active receiver in the NFL, would openly say that his team should relocate out of the city that they currently play in. Can't imagine Walter Payton saying the Bears should get out of Chicago, or Joe Montana saying that the 49ers should get out of San Francisco. But that's exactly what James Lofton was suggesting the Packers do here. The press conference started out alright and fairly normal. He said that the team loved playing in Milwaukee, that this was their favorite trip of the whole season, that the players loved the feeling of having a big city behind them, and that any reports that players were unhappy about splitting games and having to play some games in Milwaukee was a bunch of baloney. So far, so good. Now if he just left it at that, there would be no problem whatsoever, and this would be a complete non-story. But this is where things get a bit weird, because just like the Energizer Bunny, he just kept going. As Lofton said, a lot of the players, black and white, would love to be based here and play games out of Milwaukee instead of Green Bay. Now before we go any further, you might be wondering, and understandably so, why Lofton brought race into this issue. I'm not going to dive too much into the specifics of it because that's not what this video is about, but in the 1980s, Milwaukee was one of the most segregated cities in America, where among the 50 US metropolitan areas with the largest black populations, Milwaukee was, by far, the most segregated. So Lofton, a black player, was basically saying during this that all the players, regardless of race, felt comfortable and liked playing in Milwaukee. Just thought I'd bring that up in case anyone was confused as to why this was even mentioned in the first place. Having said that, here was Lofton openly saying that if it was up to him, the Packers would move to Milwaukee, and they didn't really want anything to do with Green Bay. And then, Lofton continued, because Lofton was thinking about his future and realized that if his future was in Green Bay, he would be screwed. Lofton, who expressed his disappointment on the news, said, "You have to realize that after 4 or 5 years of football, you have to be able to blend in somewhere and find a real job. There's a lot less available in Green Bay." I mean, I get it to an extent. If for whatever reason, moving is not an option, you would like to stay in the same city that you played your NFL ball at. But here's why I, along with a ton of people, are confused by this. Number one, how many players are even playing for the same team throughout their whole career? Most players don't. Even though this was 1983, and this was before the days of free agency, they get cut at some point, or they get traded, or they request their release. So this really isn't a problem. It's not like playing for the Packers means you're bound to Green Bay forever. But number two, why is James Lofton the one saying this? His career is not ending anytime soon. He's 26 years old. He just came off of a 1982 season where he was named a Pro Bowler for the 3rd straight season and was named a second-team All-Pro, and where he finished 5th in receiving yards. It'd be one thing if he was a journeyman or was nearing the end of his career, but his career was literally just getting started, and he was quite literally the most secure person on the Packers. If the Packers had to cut every player on their team in 1983 except for one, and start from scratch except for one player, odds are the one they'd keep would be James Lofton. This is like a parent complaining about college being too expensive and complaining about the hardships of trying to put their kid through college and pay for it when the kid is on a full ride. Like, okay, you might have a point, but you're literally the last person who should be making that point. And if that wasn't bad enough, he criticized Lambeau Field and praised Milwaukee County Stadium. He didn't care about the infield dirt, because it made it seem like old-fashioned football, and he liked that. Lofton said, "I like the county stadium field because it's flat. There's a big hump in Lambeau Field that makes it almost ridiculous for a passing game." I'm not going to talk too much about this one, because that is a fair criticism that I can't really argue against. He's the one playing on the surface, and if he feels that one is significantly better and safer than another, then that is his prerogative. However, I should note two things about Lofton's affiliation with Milwaukee, because he may be just a teeny tiny bit biased here. Number one, the best game of his career at the time was on September 10th, 1978, when in a 28-17 victory against the New Orleans Saints, he had 3 catches for 107 yards and 3 touchdowns. He pulled a Randy Moss before Randy Moss did it with 3 catches and 3 touchdowns on Thanksgiving. And just like Randy Moss, he did it against a team that passed on him, as the Saints had the number 3 pick in the draft that year, and used it to take Wes Chandler, a different wide receiver, so that had to feel pretty good to show the Saints what they were missing out on. That game, which was the first home game he ever played, took place in Milwaukee, so there is some sentimental attachment to the city from that. Number 2, he owns a condo in Milwaukee that he stayed in during the off-season, so of course it would be better for him, because it means he wouldn't have to pay for lodging in Green Bay. Being in a city that you love that sets you up for the future, even if the future isn't until a decade from now, and pay less while doing so, seems like an absolute win on Lofton's part. I guess for Lofton, the story has a bit of a mixed bag ending. On one hand, he did not get his wish. The Packers, to the shock of literally no one, did not move out of Green Bay to go to a baseball stadium 100 miles away. However, the Milwaukee agreement was not reduced to just 2 games per year, as up until 1994, the Packers played 3 home games a year in Milwaukee. For players who like making the trip and playing the games up there, they got to continue doing that 3 times a year, just like they did in just about every season in the Super Bowl era. Lofton didn't finish his career in Green Bay, so that whole point he made about needing his team to play somewhere where he could establish his future was all for nothing. However, it's undeniable that Lofton was an incredible receiver, as by the time his career ended after the 1993 season, he had 14,004 receiving yards, making him the all-time leader in NFL history in this category. Pretty good career if I do say so myself. But even the best careers have a blemish here and there, and this has to be one of them. So what's the moral of the story? Don't advocate for your own team to move to a different city. That just doesn't seem like the smart thing to do. You're alienating the fans that root for you. And if you're so concerned about job opportunities in Green Bay after you retire, bashing the city by saying there aren't a whole lot of opportunities probably doesn't help your cause the way that you think it does. Just about everyone considers the Packers to be a staple of Green Bay, and no one can imagine the team playing anywhere else. But for James Lofton, he was one of the only people on earth banging the drum to try and get his team to say good day to Green Bay. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, and subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot. And be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at Jaguar Gator 9. To see college football videos, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. So you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.